If you haven't heard by now, there's this thing people are monitoring and measuring called heart rate variability, or HRV. Athletes, biohackers, biofeedback practitioners, cardiologists, and other healthcare providers are all looking at this non-invasive measurement as a way to gain some insight into the function and working of the nervous system. Hi everyone, Dr. Brad here, and Murphy. A number of people have been asking me about HRV, so I thought I would offer a brief explanation. This is something I use with patients and clients continually, and I myself monitor my HRV on a variety of devices pretty much on a daily basis. So let's take a look. If you are remotely interested in health, as an athlete or someone trying to minimize the impacts of stress on your life, you most likely have come across these three letters, HRV, or heart rate variability. In fact, so many wearables, devices, and apps are on the market right now, all touting the benefit of monitoring and tracking this measurement. But what is it? Heart rate variability, quite simply put, is defined as the time difference between subsequent or consecutive heartbeats. That's it. The time difference between heartbeats. You might be under the impression that the heart is like a metronome, consistently beating at a steady pace and rhythm, but that's not the case at all. Our heart rate changes continually, adjusting constantly to the changes in our lives. And this variability provides some valuable insights into the function of our nervous system, as well as our body's ability to adapt to stress. Our cardiovascular system is regulated by the autonomic nervous system, and that sends signals from the brain down to the heart, as well as from the heart back to the brain. The two main branches of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, both have very specific influences over the heart and its rate. The sympathetic branch sends signals down to the pacemaker of the heart, known as the sinoatrial node, but it also sends signals throughout the heart muscle itself. And the parasympathetic signal sends down to the SA node as well as the AV node, or the atrioventricular node, and to the muscles of the atria of the heart. But in broad strokes, our heart rate speeds up due to either an increase in the activity of the sympathetic nervous system or due to an inhibition or reduction in the activity of the parasympathetic system. The slowing down of our heart rate seems to be primarily a result of parasympathetic activity, or the lack thereof. And the nerve of the parasympathetic system that is most responsible for this is the 10th cranial nerve, known as the vagus nerve. A host of complex interactions affect the nervous system's influence on the heart. Physiological processes like the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen in our bloodstream, the sensitivity or activity of the pressure receptors called baroreceptors in our neck and in our aorta, which monitor our blood pressure, the rate of our breathing and the volume of our breathing, the regulation of our body temperature, and even the function of our kidneys all can have an impact. So how do we measure heart rate variability? There are basically two ways to calculate heart rate and heart rate variability. The most commonly known one is through ECG, or electrocardiogram, and the other is through something called the photoplethysmograph, or PPG, which measures the change in the volume of the blood in our blood vessels, something called the blood volume pulse. Let's first take a look at ECG. An ECG is a tool to detect and measure the electrical impulses through the heart. This is called a passive electrical reading and requires sensors to be attached to the body. When you see a cardiologist for a stress test, you typically have 12 sensors or 12 leads attached to your torso. However, most home HRV systems use only 2 sensors. In biofeedback training, it's common to place a sensor on each opposing wrist and have an extra sensor called the ground. Sports enthusiasts and athletes, you probably are familiar with the heart strap worn around your chest to monitor your heart rate. That's another version of an ECG. Let's look at an ECG reading. This little bump here is called the P wave, and it reflects the depolarization or contraction of the atria, the chambers of the heart which receive blood returning to it from the body or from the lungs. Now this big spike here is called the QRS complex, and that represents the depolarization and contraction of the ventricles, which are responsible for sending the blood out of the heart and into the body. The peak of this complex is represented by the letter R, and each of these R peaks represent another heartbeat. So the heart rate is calculated by measuring the time between each R to R interval. When a cardiologist orders a 24-hour Holter monitor, which I must say is the gold standard for heart rate variability measurements, they are using an ECG reading. If the time between each RR interval is 1,000 milliseconds, that would equate to a heart rate of 60 beats per minute. If the time between heart rate is less than 100 milliseconds, then your heart rate is speeding up and getting faster. If the time between heartbeats is increasing or getting longer, then your heart rate is slowing down. The number you see at the top of this graph here is the calculated heart rate based on the time interval between those adjacent RR intervals. Now, as you can see here, the heart rate is slowing down and then begins to speed up again. This is a recording of an ECG on one of my various biofeedback systems called the Alive. Now keep your eye on the middle graph. You can see the blue line indicating the ECG recording. And you can see that each successive RR interval right here, also known as the interbeat interval or IBI, the software calculates the heartbeat, the moment-to-moment changes in time in milliseconds between adjacent heartbeats or RR peaks. Now, the second way of measuring heart rate and heart rate variability that is common to most wearables and apps out there on the market today is something called the photoplethysmograph or PPG. This involves shining a light source through the tissues to measure the amount of volume or blood in the vessels, hence the name of this measurement, the blood volume pulse. Now, each time your heart beats, a volume of blood gets pushed out of the heart, creating that pulse wave throughout the vessels. The amount of blood present affects the amount of light that gets reflected back to the sensor, and that is how each beat is determined. Finger sensors and devices like the Oura Ring or Whoop and the Fitbit all use this method. Even your camera phone can function as a very, very effective and accurate photoplethysmograph. Here's an example of this type of reading. It looks very similar to an ECG, but it's not. The time between each of the peaks of the pulse wave is used to calculate the heart rate variability, and that's called the interbeat interval. So why is any of this important? For what reason would we want to monitor our HRV? As I mentioned already, the rate of our heartbeat reflects the amount of sympathetic or parasympathetic influences on our heart. When we are in a state of chronic stress, whether physically, mentally, and emotionally, our nervous system tends to shift towards the sympathetic over the parasympathetic. In such a state, our resting heart rate tends to increase, which in turn decreases the amount of variability present, so it lowers our heart rate variability. By monitoring and tracking our heart rate variability daily, we can determine the impact of our lifestyle on our nervous system. For example, for athletes, overtraining in exercise and sports tends to shift the nervous system to a predominantly sympathetic state, and so you would see a decrease in your HRV. However, other factors contribute to lowering our HRV. Physical stressors like sleep, lack of sleep, inefficient sleep, or staying up late, eating highly processed foods, or even eating foods to which you are allergic will lower your heart rate variability. Consuming alcohol, or even being dehydrated. There are mental and emotional stressors that can also have an impact on the nervous system. Worry, anxiety, rumination about finances, mortgages, presentations, exams, or work all of those impact the sympathetic nervous system and thereby affect HRV. Therefore, tracking HRV is one way to get a picture about the state of our nervous system and its resiliency and adaptability, its ability to maintain balance in the presence of stressors. The science of HRV is quite complex, but what the research does tend to suggest is this: a decreased heart rate variability value correlates to poor health outcomes such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Correlations have also been made between low HRV and a host of other physical and psychological conditions. By tracking daily HRV, you can better determine what types of activities you wish to do that day. For instance, if heart rate variability is low, you might want to take it easy, if possible, to ensure getting more sleep, drinking more water, adjusting your diet or exercise routine, and engaging in resiliency practices to strengthen the parasympathetic tone and do something we call increased vagal tone. Furthermore, you can also begin to assess how your lifestyle is influencing your HRV. You can assess how your diet, exercise are impacting your health. Finally, in addition to tracking HRV, you can also use some of the programs out there to practice resiliency exercises to strengthen the parasympathetic nervous system and increase vagal tone. And this is the crux of my work personally with people, teaching them mind-body medicine practices, whether it's breathwork, muscle relaxation and postural changes, mindfulness training, or gratitude and loving kindness practices, using those to help decrease sympathetic arousal and to tonify and strengthen the vagus nerve. If you are interested in learning more about HRV and how to use it, feel free to contact me. I hope this provided some insight as to what heart rate variability actually is. Thank you for listening,